Okay. Humans have ways of structuring truth valuations into communication. As a human, I realize that if I'm talking about a physical object, it can still be hypothetical. So let's say I'm talking about an apple, and just by saying that, I realize that the apple I'm talking about, it's hypothetical. I'm clearly not holding a real apple. I'm relating a hypothetical apple to you, the viewer. In context, most people are smart enough to realize that it is just an abstract of something they have sensory experience with. You have experienced an apple. Not, well, some people live in Africa. No, you have. If you're watching this, you have experienced an apple. Or probably seen a picture of one. I mean, if there's some Indian person, maybe, I don't know, maybe they don't have apples in some parts of the world, but as far as I know, they're pretty ubiquitous. In terms of empirical science, there is a way of describing external things and relating that to other people. And the only way to learn about those things is by sensing or experiencing them. The only way to figure out physics or astronomy or sociology or history is by seeing things around you or experiencing them somehow, or reading a book about it. There's ways of inference and deduction and induction that you can use to learn about the things around you. So, like, if you're talking about an apple, you have to learn about, in order to understand what's going on, when you see an apple, there's all kinds of experiments that humans have been doing for a long time to try to figure out what's going on with light and the physical presence of objects, and how your brain receives that signal, and whether that signal is something that's processed consciously or unconsciously, whether you're just receiving raw data or whether your brain is doing some kind of conversion along the way. So one of the things that we've learned about are photons. Photons are things that create visible light. Photons can hit an object. The object absorbs some, and the rest is reflected into the human eye as apparent color of that object. So our human vision systems convert the data, pass it off to the human brain. The brain abstracts that light into data, which the human brain can then store in short and long-term memory and do all kinds of other analyses and functions with it, both consciously and unconsciously. One of those functions is storing attributes of the object and comparing it with previously sensed objects and seeing if there's any overlap in individual attribute data between the objects. In other words, I've got an apple, and it's a red apple. I've seen other things that have similar wavelength and amplitude that resemble the color of that apple. So I can give this attribute a name. I can say, that's red. So digging down a little bit more into that, if you see two things that have similar reflected light with, similar wavelength and amplitude in a similar range, then you're going to be able to make a comparison with those two instances where you have experienced that physical phenomenon that's going on. Another example would be two things with similar shape and volume. You've seen an apple, probably. If you haven't seen an apple, you've seen an orange. So you can compare an apple and an orange and use the minor differences between those objects to describe one or the other in terms of the object that you have seen. In another part of the world, maybe they don't have apples, but they have tubers that grow in the earth, or they have, or they hunt animals and they know what shape an eyeball is, and you can compare shape and volume that way. But there are ways that your brain can consciously and unconsciously create similarities between two things. People think they hear voices because they hear stuff that's in the same acoustic range as the human voice is. It's like in the same frequency and impedance as a human voice has. So they go, oh, that was a human that was talking, instead of just, a door creaking or the floor or something. And in other cases, when you're talking directly face-to-face with somebody, there's a way of differentiating that person's voice from all the background noise that's going on, and picking a voice out in the crowd that you can hear, because you can make those comparisons when two things are sitting right next to each other, or when you've got a big distance between objects. When you're talking to other people, that data set of attributes can be translated into any of the many forms of external communication humans use to translate or use to activate recollection of a similar data set of sensory experiences in other people. Because you have witnessed other people sharing experiences of you that you have had, you can communicate those to other people. In increasing terms of accuracy. Maybe a person hasn't seen like a maggot before, but you could describe it in terms of a worm. Or let's say you've got two people who both study maggots, and they've seen tens of thousands of maggots. Eventually they're able to sort through these all to where they're able to pick out different species and maybe even different specimens. And that's just because people are able to, with communication, activate recollection in another person. And that's a conscious act. Sometimes it's unconscious, because you can't always control your facial expression. And when you're reading something, there's stuff that, like, in your larynx, your brain is activating your larynx when you're reading something. And they've tested this, scientists have tested this out with, seeing if there's electrical activity in your larynx that's showing whenever you read anything, even if you're actively trying not to, or even if you're being told, you're not being told what they're doing, what the experiment is supposed to measure, they can tell that there's electrical activity, that your brain is triggering your larynx to move in step with what you're reading. I don't know where I was going with that. It was basically just, conscious versus unconscious communication. Other people can sometimes tell that. They can tell if you're reading something, or I guess I don't think that you could actually tell exactly what somebody is reading like you can read lips. Some people move their lips when they're reading something. I guess you could maybe pick it out that way. But there's unconscious ways you can read a person, like with their body language, with micro expressions, where you're not consciously making an expression, and it happens like within a microsecond. Within a few tenths of a second, you're making an expression, and then the expression is gone, but people can still pick up on it, just because it's a reflex. It's an involuntary thing. You can't necessarily, most people can't control their body heat. So if you see something that embarrasses you, your body temperature in certain areas is going to increase. You get vasodilation in your face. Your heart can start beating faster, which is why they've had to make changes in lie detectors, because people have learned how to trick it. Your breathing moves faster when you get anxious. There's all kinds of unconscious ways of communicating, and then there's conscious ones. So somebody can unwillingly recall something. In Inception, one of the characters goes, "Don't think of a pink elephant." Well, what's going to happen? You're probably going to recall a pink elephant, and it's going to be against your will, just because it's an involuntary reflex. Because sometimes recall of information isn't voluntary. It's not a conscious act of will that you're retrieving that information, which is why you get a lot of people who have long-lasting mental disorders or mental health issues, I guess, because of post-traumatic stress syndrome, or even just somebody who, let's say you see something online that's like a shock video or something. You don't want to think about it. There's all kinds of memories that you have that people want to get brain bleach for and erase the memory of, because recalling that thing isn't necessarily voluntary. And I think this is my theory. I think maybe it's because communication isn't entirely about making somebody consciously recall something. It's just about making somebody think about something, whether or not they want to. Can I please have my computer back? So going back to the example of activating sensory experiences in other people, let's say I go, "This apple is red." The external communication must be parsed into the proper syntax of written word, symbols, speech, etc. So like I said, there's a lot of different ways of communicating. There might be even more conscious ones than there are unconscious ones, just because we think of different ways to do things all the time. But all those things, the conscious ones at least, are meant to keep the recollection that you have intact en route to the other person. There's all kinds of ways you can miscommunicate. There are tons of steps along the way in which the wrong message can get to a person. This is why we have legal cases where you have hundreds of pages of documents being submitted, and you have thousands of lines of fine print being included. We've got a tax code in part because of the need to be very specific and very exact in communicating something, to relay a message that stays as intact as possible. Sentences are written in a specific syntax corresponding to that specific method of communication. So you have rules of style, grammar, phrasing, redundancy, word choice, etc. And no matter what communication method you're talking about, you're going to have some rules of how that specific method of communicating works. Even if you're talking about computer code or smoke signals, there's going to be previously understood rules that help you communicate your message accurately. If you've got two people in the same room and neither of them understand the language of each other, there are not necessarily universals in hand communication, but you can use pointing, which seems to be a universal, among humans at least. Elephants understand it. A few other animals do. You can use mimicry. Eat. Give me something to drink. People can usually understand that, no matter what culture you're talking about. Sometimes if you train primates for long enough, they can understand stuff. Some of them. But there's always going to be some form of constraint that keeps you from being able to say one thing when you mean another, unless you want to purposely mislead someone. And I'm talking about, I'm having to do this. I'm having to specify and give exclusions to what you can and can't do. I'm talking about deliberately communicating a message to another person where both parties have a shared technique of understanding the other person. So when we're talking to other people, I'm just going to keep it in the domain of English, in spoken word or written word. Communication itself can be subject to more targeted, smaller communicative interactions. In other words, discussions. And conversations aren't the only thing that happen in communication. Like not every form of communication is a discussion, but all discussions are a form of communication. There's a much larger set of the domain of discourse, of which communication is a part of that. So you have discussions in the set of communication, and then you've got communication inside of the bigger domain of discourse, wherein you don't have to be communicating with anyone. You can just be thinking to yourself something about, an observation about the world around you. So discussions are a way of ensuring, among other things, that the same sense experiences retain integrity every step along the way. a discussion of communication has a finite scope. So you're talking within that smaller set about the bigger set. Communication at large mostly addresses the accurate transmission of sense experiences between humans. Within the domain of discourse regarding communication, the range of possible discussions is still large relative to the theoretically infinite universal domain of discourse. And what I mean by that is there's impossible things you can talk about, and there's possible things you can talk about. But really there's no limit, theoretically, to what you can talk about, because you can talk about infinite numbers, or unnatural numbers, or repeating digits, or you could talk about space as it is a null void that has no vacuum force or any kind of particular wave inside of it, and how many different places in the universe consist of null voids. An example is what I'm talking about right now is communication about communication. I hope this thing is set to where you can actually see me. The order of transmission of those attributes or data sets, it goes something like this. You have a sense experience that goes to received perception, to brain analysis, memory, comparison, and we can call that data set A. That set goes to retrieving words to syntax, to sentence, internally, to activated external communication methods. For example, speech, writing, sign language, flags, smoke signals, etc. Morse code, there's no end to the number of ways that people communicate, either now or before in prehistory. Well, more now because we're smarter now than we used to be. So that to external communication via whatever physical means the brain controls. So there's your larynx, your hands, facial expression, etc., body language. There's a lot of ways your brain can control your body, and from there on out it's kind of like multiplying infinity times infinity. It's exponentially the number of ways that you can relay a message gets exponentially larger, even though you're talking about a finite thing. So that communication is either unconsciously or consciously performed by the first party, and we can label this data set B. So you've got data set A, which is the storage of the original thing that you've witnessed, and it's internal. And then there's data set B, which is the packet of information you're sending out from yourself into the external world around you. The sensory experience of communication is thus made available for perception by the second party. The second party perceives the sense experience created by the first party. This perceived data goes through whatever transmission path the brain uses to process abstracted information from other humans and ends up as brain analysis, memory, and comparison. we can call this data set C. So it's the received and processed information on the second party's part. From there, the parties can proceed to a range of discourse limited only by the theoretically infinite universal domain of discourse. So that's what I have written up so far. I'd rather not continue to talk until I actually write down some more information. Please let this have been recorded. Yeah, you did. Okay, so if you have any comments on just this short conversation, they're welcome. I realize there's a lot of holes in this. This isn't so much a discussion about logic so much as it is leading back to recursively studying logic. Because logic tends to be more about the first data set, where you have gone through the process of sensing something and storing it and are now analyzing that data. Now, of course, there's a lot of different ways to relay logic, but communication isn't so much about that as it is just sorting out what it is that you've witnessed, or even more so about what you have not witnessed. Whether you can create inferences or inductions about what you know or what you think you know. So in other words, epistemology. What's the other one? Yeah, see, I'm running out of things to say, so I'd rather stick to just kind of writing down notes and then talking about those notes. Like, comment, and subscribe.